When a newly hired security guard at Greenfields Mall spots a little girl clutching a man's jacket in silent terror, he tells himself it's probably just a tired child having a rough day. But as he digs deeper, one small observation leads to another, and he soon uncovers a chilling network hidden right under the mall's bright lights. What unfolds is a relentless struggle for justice and safety, pushing him beyond his comfort zone into the darkest corners of human cruelty. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for vigilance and compassion, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more. Anthony Scott had only been at Greenfields Mall for 3 weeks, and in many ways, he was still finding his footing. The mall itself seemed a small city, a labyrinth of corridors, a kaleidoscope of store windows showcasing everything from gleaming jewelry to neon athletic shoes. Its sprawling parking lots were like plains of asphalt, and its wide interior walkways bustled with parents towing excited kids, teenagers buzzing with weekend freedom, and older couples looking for a climate-controlled place to take their daily walks. Every so often, a faint whiff of cinnamon pretzels or strong espresso wafted by, mixing with the soft hum of air conditioning. Whenever Anthony walked his route, he felt the tension of wanting to appear both confident and approachable, an authority figure but not an overbearing one. He was 28 years old, clean-cut, and stood just a bit over 6 feet tall. A trim, athletic build from his years of playing community football gave him a certain presence. He was no giant, but he could carry himself well enough. He'd grown up in a rougher part of town, always wanting to stand for something good. He admired firefighters, police officers, local coaches who mentored kids. When the opportunity came to become a security guard, he saw it as a stepping stone to fulfilling that need to protect people. It wasn't exactly what he dreamed of. He had once toyed with the idea of joining the police academy, but it paid decently and gave him a badge. A small badge, maybe, and his authority was limited, but he could still make a difference, at least in theory. In those first few weeks, everything had been mundane. He helped store employees with petty shoplifters, mostly bored teens swiping cheap accessories, escorted the occasional disgruntled customer away from a storefront, and once broke up a quarrel between 2 men fighting over a parking space. Not exactly heroics, but it kept him on his toes. Then one Wednesday afternoon he saw her, a girl who looked about 9 or 10, with dark hair pulled back in a low ponytail, tears glimmering on her lashes. She was wearing a pink jacket, slightly too big for her frame, and holding tight to a tall man's sleeve. The man, possibly in his mid-30s, had neatly trimmed facial hair, wore a charcoal gray jacket even though it was warm inside, and radiated tension as if every muscle in his body was coiled for action. Anthony initially clocked it as a parent dealing with a child's meltdown. The odd part was how the girl's eyes darted around, like a startled deer searching for an escape. She didn't cling to the man so much as hang off him, her small fingers trembling on his jacket cuff. Anthony paused near a kiosk that sold novelty phone cases, pretending to survey the foot traffic. Deep down, an unease rooted itself in his gut. As a security guard, part of his job was to watch for anything that set off alarm bells. Plenty of kids cried in the mall. But the fear in this girl's eyes was different. It cut deeper. He took a breath and walked over, adopting the calm, friendly tone he used when approaching a family. "Hey there," he said, looking from the girl to the man. "Everything all right? You two need any help finding something?" The man turned, and Anthony noticed how quickly he forced a smile. "Oh, we're fine," he said in a smooth voice. He had this neat folder in his hand, which he didn't immediately open. "My niece is just upset because she wanted a toy she couldn't have. You know kids?" He let out an artificial chuckle, glancing down at the girl. "Elena, say hello to the security guard." But Elena stayed silent. Her face looked pale, and her eyes darted up at Anthony with a kind of pleading that made his chest tighten. Then the man smoothly slid out a couple of papers. "I'm her legal guardian while her folks are overseas. If there's a problem, I can show you everything." He waved them around in a quick flourish, not quite letting Anthony read them in detail but enough to see official seals and signatures. Anthony felt stuck. The documents looked legitimate from his brief glance, and the man projected total confidence. "All right," Anthony said carefully. "Just checking." "She does look upset." "Kids," the man repeated, a short laugh. "You have a good day, officer." With a firm tug, he led Elena away from Anthony and down the corridor, disappearing into a swirl of shoppers. Anthony's skin crawled. The entire exchange had a brittle, stilted quality to it, and that child's desperate eyes were burned into his memory. Yet he had no direct evidence that a crime was happening. What was he supposed to do, chase after them based on a hunch? He tried to put it out of his mind, resuming his patrol, nodding at store managers he recognized. But that evening, as he drove his beat-up sedan home to his small studio apartment, he couldn't shake the anxiety. What if that little girl really was in trouble? He told himself that maybe the man was just strict, or that the girl had been scolded and was sulking. And yet his gut said otherwise. The next morning, Anthony approached his supervisor, Karen Peterson, about what he'd seen. Karen, a woman in her 40s with meticulously done blonde hair and a perpetual look of stress etched onto her features, managed the security team with a laser focus on the mall's image. She listened politely as Anthony described the man, the child, the suspicious vibe. "I understand your concern," Karen said, fiddling with a pen on her desk. "But if the guy showed you legitimate documents, that means there's nothing we can do without probable cause. If we start detaining every adult who's with a crying kid, we'd get sued. Do you have any reason to believe the documents were fake?" Anthony shifted in his seat. "Not for sure. But the girl she looked really scared." Karen exhaled, her lips pressing into a tight line. "I get it, but I can't authorize a manhunt on your hunch. If you see something obviously illegal, someone physically hurting a child, for instance, then you can step in. Otherwise, keep your eyes open, but don't overstep." Anthony left, shoulders tense. He understood Karen's logic but felt frustrated. Hunches weren't enough in the eyes of the law, especially at a busy mall that served thousands of people daily. He did exactly as she said, kept an eye out for that man, or for the girl, Elena. But for a while, it was as if they had vanished. A few days later, he started noticing small anomalies across the mall. There would be a kid around 8 or 9, walking alongside a stranger who looked ill at ease. Or a teenage girl with an older couple who scanned the area nervously before passing her off to a different adult. At first, Anthony chalked it up to families or babysitters with rowdy kids. But once the seed of suspicion had been planted, each instance took on a sinister hue. He started carrying a small notepad in his back pocket, scribbling quick notes, times, places, any distinct clothing or features. Child in pink hoodie with tall woman in red scarf, next seen with older man in baseball cap near escalators. Anthony had no immediate proof these were abductions or trafficking incidents, but the patterns gnawed at him. Multiple times, he thought he caught a glimpse of that same tall man in a charcoal gray jacket, leading different children on different days. Each time, the man seemed to disappear before Anthony could get close. One quiet morning, as Anthony strolled past the indoor playground, a spot designed for toddlers to climb on foam obstacles, he saw a man in his early 30s sitting alone on a bench, phone out, eyes scanning the play area. Next to him was a little girl of about 6 or 7, bouncing on a small rocking horse. The man looked vaguely familiar. Anthony had seen him bring that same girl here once or twice. The moment the man locked eyes with Anthony, he stood and approached. "Hey, sorry to bother you," the man said in a low voice. "Are you the guard who's been asking around about some suspicious activity?" He had a gentle but determined expression, as though he'd mulled over this approach for a while. Anthony cleared his throat. "I've asked a few people some questions." "Yeah. Why?" The man offered his hand. "Name's Jordan Reyes. That's my daughter, Lydia." He nodded at the girl, who was happily rocking away. "Look, I saw you a few times, and I heard from one of the kiosk clerks that you were looking into a guy who might be hurting a child. I might have something for you." "Okay," Anthony said, tensing in curiosity. Jordan glanced around. Mind if we talk someplace quieter? I don't want my daughter picking up on any of this. She's just a kid. They ended up in a small corridor near the restrooms, Lydia in tow, but playing a game on Jordan's phone to keep her distracted. Jordan explained, in hushed tones, that a few days ago he'd seen a tall man practically dragging a girl out the side exit near the parking structure. She looked around 9, and from the corner of his eye, Jordan thought she might have been crying. I tried filming it, Jordan said, but all I got was a few seconds of shaky footage. I was too far away to see their faces clearly. But the SUV they got into had heavily tinted windows. I only caught part of the license plate. Then they were gone. The way he shoved her in, it just didn't look right. Anthony's heart thudded. Can I see the video? Jordan nodded, rummaging for his phone. He showed Anthony a short clip, the camera mostly capturing the asphalt, then jerking up just as the SUV's door slammed. A tall silhouette was there, and a small figure, possibly a child, climbing into the back seat under duress. The angle was poor, the lighting worse, but it was enough to send chills through Anthony's gut. Did you show this to anyone else? Anthony asked. I told one of the other security guards, but he seemed more annoyed than concerned, Jordan replied. Said something about false reports causing panic. Look, I'm a father. If that was my daughter being manhandled like that, I'd pray someone would notice. I can't just let it go. Anthony nodded slowly. I get you. Listen, my boss, she's hesitant to do anything without rock-solid proof. But if more people like you come forward, maybe we can push for an investigation. They exchanged phone numbers, forging an uneasy alliance. Over the next week, Jordan texted Anthony whenever he was in the mall, often describing suspicious glimpses, kids who seemed to appear and disappear with the same few adults, the black SUV with tinted windows lurking near loading docks. Anthony tried cross-referencing times with security camera footage. He discovered fleeting clips, a tall man leading a child down an empty corridor, then handing her off to a woman. The images were grainy, the vantage poor. No one stayed in frame for long. It was enough to rouse Anthony's alarm, but not enough to be certain a crime was unfolding. One evening, Anthony gathered the most compelling clips and approached Karen in her office. Please, he said, cueing the footage on a monitor. Look at this. Same man with multiple kids, different days, sometimes handing them off. Doesn't that set off alarm bells? Karen watched with arms folded. She grimaced but shook her head. Kids come in with different relatives sometimes, cousins, step-siblings, babysitters. There's no definitive wrongdoing captured here, Anthony. But these kids look terrified, Anthony pressed, pausing on a frame that showed a small boy, glancing over his shoulder anxiously, led by a man in a hoodie. Don't you see the posture, the body language? Karen exhaled. Body language can be misleading. Look, I'm not heartless, but you're basically suggesting child trafficking is happening here. That's a huge accusation. We can't make that claim lightly. If we cause a public panic and it turns out to be nothing, the lawsuits alone could bury us. Anthony fought down frustration. Maybe it is child trafficking. It's one of the only explanations that fits all these weird handoffs. And the black SUV Jordan saw? That might be their transport vehicle. Karen pursed her lips. Listen, if you find something indisputable, like a plate number or actual footage of an abduction, then we'll contact law enforcement. Until then, I can't authorize any major push. I'm sorry. Anthony left, feeling hollow. Still, he refused to give up. He spent off-duty hours poring over additional footage Jordan supplied or reviewing cameras from the mall's side exits where it was easier to slip away unnoticed. Occasionally, he spotted that black SUV parked in a corner of the lot, but the angle was too distant to catch the license plate. He spotted what might have been Robert, or at least a man wearing the same charcoal gray jacket, chatting with a mall custodian behind one of the dumpsters. There was a furtive exchange, possibly an envelope for cash? The footage was too poor to confirm. Days crept by. Anthony's personal logs grew. He had pages of notes on suspicious times, sightings, partial descriptions of men and women who might be part of this ring. Meanwhile, Jordan texted more frequently with updates, sometimes even capturing a snippet of phone video. Often it was shaky or inconclusive, like a figure hurrying a child into a restroom, the camera losing them behind a crowd. The puzzle pieces refused to snap together in any definitive pattern. Yet the repeated glimpses of possible wrongdoing had Anthony convinced that something major and evil was happening under the mall's fluorescent lights. Then, a week later, Anthony received a tip from a coworker that made his blood run cold. Vince, another security guard who usually just cared about finishing his shift on time, mentioned he'd overheard a police report that a little girl named Elena had gone missing, last seen leaving her elementary school 2 days prior. Vince remembered Anthony's mention of a child named Elena. "She's on a missing person flyer," Vince said, passing Anthony a paper. "Might be the same kid, if your memory's right." Anthony stared at the photo, a small, smiling girl with dark hair, definitely around 9 or 10. The name read Elena Martinez. The flyer stated she was last seen wearing a pink jacket. He clenched his jaw, recalling the pink jacket the little girl wore when he first encountered her with Robert. A chill spread through him. If this was the same Elena, she wasn't just frightened, she was missing. And it might already be too late. He rushed back to Karen with the flyer in hand. "I found her," he exclaimed, voice nearly trembling with urgency. "The missing girl's name is Elena Martinez. I'm telling you, this is the same girl that guy had. She's missing, Karen. We have to call the police, show them the footage." Karen took the flyer, scanning it. She looked up at Anthony, troubled. "The cops have sent us a general request for footage from the last couple weeks, which we'll comply with. But that's all we can do right now." "I know it's frustrating." "We should be combing every second of footage, Karen," Anthony interrupted, face hot with anger. "She's out there, possibly in serious danger. And if the suspects are using the mall as some handoff site for multiple kids, who knows how many more are being trafficked?" Karen sighed, rubbing her temples. "I will talk to the police detective assigned to the case, see what they want. But please don't go beyond your duties, Anthony. That's not an order, that's a plea. You could get yourself fired or worse. Let the authorities handle it." Anthony tried to keep his voice steady. "The authorities are swamped. We need to help. At least let me keep searching the cameras in detail, off the clock if need be." Karen hesitated, then relented. "Fine if you must. But keep it quiet. The mall can't have rumors flying around that a trafficking ring is definitely operating here." "Understood." Anthony nodded stiffly. He'd do anything to find Elena, no matter the risk to his job. That same evening, he and Jordan met at a small cafe just outside the mall. Jordan bought them both coffee. His own daughter, Lydia, was at a friend's house, sparing them the awkwardness of discussing child trafficking in front of her. Anthony slid the missing person flyer across the table, explaining that Elena was officially missing. Jordan stared at Elena's photo. "So it's confirmed? This is the same girl you saw with that tall guy?" "Almost certain," Anthony said. "It lines up with the pink jacket, the name, the age. And she's vanished. Police have a file open, but they don't have a strong lead." Jordan shook his head, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "This is insane. Are we sure this is a trafficking ring, or could it be a custody battle or something?" Anthony shrugged, frustration tightening his features. "Trafficking is the best explanation for all these suspicious kids with different adults, the black SUV, the possible envelope exchanges. It's not some single kidnapping by a disgruntled relative. This is bigger." They discussed a plan. Jordan would make it a point to linger around the loading docks and less populated hallways whenever he visited with Lydia, though he'd keep her at a safe distance. Anthony would systematically review camera footage from specific times Jordan flagged as suspicious. The ultimate goal was to catch a plate number, or get a clear shot of a handoff that couldn't be explained away as innocent. They needed something to give the police so they would act swiftly. They parted with a grim sense of determination. By the next week, The pressure weighed heavily on Anthony's shoulders. His daily routine involved mindlessly deterring shoplifters while his mind churned with the question, where is Elena? What if she's not even in the state anymore? Jordan sent him a frantic text one afternoon, saying he'd overheard two men by the staff hallway referencing a park and a Thursday drop. Jordan caught only fragments, but they mentioned a name that sounded like Robert, telling him not to be late. Anthony's heart pounded. Robert was the name the man gave him that first day. They realized the park mentioned must be Hazelwood Park, a relatively secluded spot a few miles from the mall. If there was going to be a child handoff there, maybe they could catch the traffickers in the act. Anthony wanted to call the police immediately, but they had little detail. No license plate, no certain time, just Thursday drop. The last time he tried to give the police partial leads, they acknowledged it but didn't throw resources at something so vague. So he and Jordan decided, perhaps recklessly, to set up their own stakeout. On Thursday evening, they each left work early. Jordan dropped Lydia off with a babysitter, and Anthony told Karen he had a family obligation. The sun was setting by the time they parked Jordan's car on a quiet street near Hazelwood Park. The place was a mix of wooded trails, a small pond, and some picnic tables, usually empty after dusk. They found a vantage point near a row of bushes with a decent view of the lone parking lot. Anthony carried an old pair of binoculars he'd borrowed from his dad's garage. Jordan clutched his phone, ready to record or call the police if anything suspicious happened. Time crawled. A few dog walkers passed, an older couple strolled by. Over an hour went by without anything but the chirp of crickets. Anthony felt a growing ache in his back from crouching. Jordan's phone glowed faintly every so often as he checked the time. They were beginning to doubt the tip, thinking maybe the traffickers had changed plans. Then headlights appeared, slicing through the darkness. A black SUV pulled in, parking under a tree at the far end of the lot. The driver's door opened, and even from a distance, Anthony's heart lurched at the silhouette, tall, lean, wearing a dark jacket. "That's him," Anthony whispered, hand shaking as he lifted the binoculars. Robert stepped out, scanning the area warily. After a few seconds, the back door opened, and Anthony saw the small figure of a child climb out. The distance was too great for him to see her face clearly, but she looked about the right height. The child stood uncertainly, close to Robert. Anthony's adrenaline spiked. "Oh God," he breathed. "That might be Elena." A second car glided into the lot, a dark sedan. Two men got out, one older and heavy-set, the other wiry with an angular face. They approached Robert and the child, voices too distant to hear. Jordan quietly began filming with his phone. Anthony noticed one man passing an envelope to Robert while the other gestured toward the child, who shrank back as though terrified. "That's definitely an exchange," Jordan whispered. "They're paying him for the kid." Anthony clenched his fists. "We have to call 911. No." Jordan hit the call button, speaking in hushed tones to the dispatcher, urging them to hurry. Meanwhile, Anthony watched through the binoculars as the men became more animated. The child seemed to cling to Robert's sleeve, or maybe she was trying to pull away. The heavy-set man grabbed her arm. Her body language screamed distress, even though Anthony couldn't hear her cries. Jordan finished the call. "They said they're sending units. We gotta keep them here or they'll be gone before the cops arrive," he hissed. "Right?" Anthony whispered, but the reality of confronting multiple traffickers with no backup sent a surge of fear through him. The men outnumbered them and could be armed. Suddenly, one of the men, the wiry one, swung a flashlight across the trees. Its beam danced dangerously close to the bushes where Anthony and Jordan crouched. "Who's there?" the wiry man shouted, his voice carrying across the lot. The heavy-set man barked something in an urgent tone. Robert stiffened, scanning the darkness. Anthony's breath caught. If the traffickers spooked, they'd grab the child and vanish. He looked at Jordan. They both knew the risk. They had to stall or the entire chance to rescue the child would be lost. With adrenaline pounding in his veins, Anthony rose from behind the bushes, arms held out in what he hoped was a calm, non-threatening gesture. "Stop," he called. "We've called the police. Let the girl go." Chaos erupted. The men whipped around. Robert's eyes widened in recognition. "You," he spat, pulling the child behind him. The heavy-set man advanced on Anthony, fists raised. Jordan emerged too, phone still recording. "Don't move," Jordan shouted, though his voice trembled. "The cops are almost here." The child let out a sob, echoing in the stillness. Robert hissed an order to the wiry man, "Grab her," and the wiry man tried to wrestle the child toward the SUV. Anthony lunged forward, grappling with the heavy-set man who swung a wild punch. Pain exploded in Anthony's shoulder, but he managed to hold his ground, hooking an arm around the heavy-set man's midsection. Jordan attempted to pull the child free from the wiry man, but Robert shoved him violently. Jordan hit the ground, phone clattering away. The child screamed, tears streaking down her face as she tried to break free from the wiry man's grip. In the distance, sirens grew louder. The traffickers realized time was short. The heavy-set man twisted out of Anthony's grasp, throwing him onto the gravel. Robert shouted, "We gotta go." The wiry man hauled the child toward the SUV. Anthony, dazed from the fall, forced himself up, lungs burning, and tackled Robert's legs as he tried to run. They went down hard, fists flailing. Robert caught Anthony with a blow to the side of his jaw, but Anthony gritted his teeth, refusing to let him get away. Blue and red lights washed over the scene. 2 police cruisers careened into the lot, officers leaping out with guns drawn. One officer sprinted toward the wiry man, who abandoned the child in a scramble to jump into the sedan. The heavy-set man made for the SUV, but an officer tackled him. Jordan crawled toward the child, wrapping an arm around her protectively. She clung to him, eyes wild with terror. Robert tried to bolt, but Anthony grabbed him by the collar, and an officer quickly assisted, slamming Robert to the ground. Another officer pressed a knee into Robert's back, cuffing him. "Don't move," the officer barked. Sirens and shouting filled the air, the chaotic swirl of a takedown. The child sobbed uncontrollably, while Jordan held her and repeated, "It's okay, you're safe," though he was out of breath, voice shaking. Eventually, more police arrived, scanning the area with flashlights. The sedan managed to tear out of the lot, squealing tires, leaving the wiry man possibly inside. Officers tried to chase but lost them in the dark. Yet they had caught Robert and the heavy-set man, along with the black SUV. Anthony sat on the ground, wincing at his bruised ribs and split lip. He watched paramedics arrive, checking on the girl, who was trembling and pale, but alive. She looked so small, so fragile in the ambulance's glow. Anthony's heart lurched with relief. He hadn't even confirmed yet if she was Elena, but at least one child was saved tonight. As the police started taking statements, another car pulled up. Out stepped Karen, hair disheveled, face etched with worry. She spoke with the officers, then hurried to where Anthony and Jordan were being questioned. She stood there, arms wrapped around herself, and whispered, "I gave them everything. After you left with that final tip, I found more footage. I couldn't just sit on it. I'm sorry for not believing you sooner." Anthony, exhausted and aching, nodded slowly. "Thank you. You did the right thing." The paramedics ushered the child onto a stretcher. An officer asked gently, "Can you tell us your name?" She sniffled, wiping tears with the back of her hand. "Elena," she whispered. Anthony felt tears prick his own eyes. It was her. The child he'd first seen clutching Robert's jacket. She was safe, physically at least. Whatever scars remained would take time to heal. Anthony gave his statement to a detective, recounting everything from the moment he first spotted Elena in the mall to that night's confrontation. Jordan did the same. The detective, a tall woman with a calm yet firm demeanor, took notes. "We've had rumors of a trafficking operation in this area, but you two just handed us the biggest break we've gotten," she said. "It's dangerous work you did here, could have ended badly. But I'm grateful you intervened." Once the dust settled, Anthony found himself in the back of an ambulance too, being checked for a possible concussion. He stared at the swirling lights of the police cruisers, numb with the realization that they had just saved a child from a horrific fate. Jordan, bruised and dirty, patted Anthony's shoulder. "We did it," Jordan said softly. "We found her." Anthony forced a smile. "Yeah, but it's not over. There might be more kids. More traffickers." Jordan nodded solemnly, and they lapsed into a silence heavy with both relief and dread. The following weeks were a whirlwind of investigations, arrests, and shocking revelations. Robert turned out to be part of a local ring that specialized in forging legal documents to pose as guardians or relatives. They exploited busy public places, like the mall, to conduct handoffs. The heavy-set man sang like a canary when confronted with the evidence and the threat of federal charges, revealing more names and locations. The police raided several properties, rescuing more kids, though some had already been moved elsewhere, spurring multi-state alerts. Elena's testimony became crucial, though she was deeply traumatized. She spent her first days in a hospital ward for victims of abuse, receiving counseling and medical evaluations. Media outlets latched onto the story of how a mall security guard and a concerned single father had helped expose a child trafficking ring. Cameras flashed as reporters tried to snag interviews. Anthony, uncomfortable with the sudden attention, insisted on keeping the focus on Elena and the other children. Jordan gave a brief statement on local TV about how parents needed to stay vigilant, how abusers thrived on people's unwillingness to make a fuss. Meanwhile, Karen faced a storm of criticism. Whispers circulated that she had initially tried to hush rumors for fear of damaging the mall's reputation. Whether or not she had taken hush money or simply chosen to avoid controversy wasn't entirely clear. Either way, the board forced her resignation. She quietly turned over all the footage and internal memos related to suspicious mall activity, helping to build the strongest case possible against the traffickers. Anthony discovered that Elena did indeed have parents, but they were overseas for work, and Elena had been staying with a distant aunt who had also gone missing. The ring had somehow intercepted Elena, forging guardian documents, planning to sell her to the highest bidder. The level of cruelty sickened Anthony. He visited Elena once, at the center where she was placed under protective custody. She seemed shy, still anxious around adult men, but she recognized Anthony from that night and offered a small, tentative smile. He brought her a stuffed bear as a gift. She didn't say much, she was still in shock, but she clutched the bear and whispered, "Thank you," before a counselor gently guided her away. Meanwhile, the police discovered that the black SUV had multiple stolen license plates. Robert was a mid-level operative, and the wiry man who got away was apparently higher up. The ring extended beyond the state, meaning the FBI got involved. Anthony watched in amazement as the story he had uncovered ballooned into a multi-jurisdictional investigation. In the midst of it all, he had to keep working his shifts at the mall, though the new management was grateful for what he had done. Some customers recognized him from news reports, offering thanks or calling him a hero. It felt surreal. He'd never aimed to be in a spotlight, he just couldn't ignore Elena's terrified eyes. Still, the drama wasn't quite done. Anthony and Jordan both had to testify at the preliminary hearings. They recounted how they documented suspicious exchanges at the mall, how Jordan overheard talk of a Thursday drop, how they staked out Hazelwood Park. The defense lawyers tried to suggest that they had trespassed, that they were vigilantes, that the footage was circumstantial, but the evidence was too strong. Robert and several accomplices were bound over for trial on charges of conspiracy, kidnapping, child trafficking, and more. The date for the trial was set a couple of months out. In the meantime, the ring members who had been caught were held without bail, given the flight risk. As the weeks turned into months, Elena was placed into foster care once her immediate relatives were ruled out or found unfit, her parents still overseas, apparently in the midst of complicated personal issues. She was quiet, prone to nightmares, but slowly began regaining some measure of childlike wonder. Anthony, in his free time, checked on her progress. The foster family was kind, specialized in helping victims of abuse, and they welcomed the occasional visit from Anthony or Jordan. On one such visit, Anthony noticed Elena was reading a children's book about heroes and bravery. She blushed when she realized he was glancing at the pages, but she managed a shy smile. "I want to be strong," she whispered. Anthony crouched beside her, voice gentle. "You already are. You were so brave, holding on until we found you." Her eyes shimmered with tears, but she nodded, hugging the stuffed bear he'd given her weeks ago. These small steps toward healing were a balm for Anthony's own battered emotions. The guilt of not intervening sooner still gnawed at him. He replayed the day he first saw her, wishing he'd found a way to act faster. Yet he knew he had done what he could. Eventually, the trial date arrived. By then, more co-conspirators had been arrested, including the mall custodian who had apparently been accepting bribes to turn a blind eye and occasionally unlock restricted areas for shady transactions. The prosecution lined up multiple witnesses, from rescued children, testifying in carefully arranged conditions, to expert analysts who specialized in human trafficking. Anthony and Jordan were star witnesses for the state, given they'd been the first to raise alarms and gather evidence. Karen, too, was scheduled to testify about the internal camera footage and her eventual decision to notify the police. The entire community watched, hungry for justice. Courtrooms always felt oppressive to Anthony, with their solemn wood paneling, the hush of tension as soon as the judge entered. On the day Anthony was to testify, he saw Robert in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the ankles, glaring from the defense table. It sent a chill through Anthony to remember how imposing Robert had seemed that day in the mall, brandishing those fake documents with such confidence. Now, he looked smaller, but his eyes still burned with anger. The prosecutor, a determined woman named Linda Shaw, questioned Anthony methodically, having him describe the timeline of suspicious sightings, how he met Jordan, how they discovered Elena was missing, the stakeout at Hazelwood Park, the physical confrontation. Anthony answered in detail, voice trembling at times. The defense attorney tried to trip him up on minor inconsistencies, exact times, vantage points, but Anthony's sincerity and the overall consistency of his account shone through. Jordan's testimony echoed the same narrative. He even provided phone footage exhibits, albeit shaky, showing the black SUV and the partial handoffs. The prosecution painted a damning picture of a well-organized ring that used public spaces to camouflage the movement of children like merchandise. Robert's defense team claimed it was all a misunderstanding or a frame-up, but the evidence was overwhelming. Then came the hardest part for Anthony, seeing Elena, perched in a separate room with a closed-circuit video setup, prepared to give a statement. She was only allowed to be questioned by the attorneys, not face-to-face with Robert. Even so, her voice trembled so badly that at times she could barely speak. She had to recount being threatened, coerced into calling Robert uncle, forced to pose as though they were family. The prosecutor carefully guided her, step by step. The defense attorney's cross-examination was gentler than it might have been with an adult, but still tried to cast doubt. Elena's eyes brimmed with tears as she insisted that Robert was not her uncle, that she was truly afraid for her life, that the documents he showed were all lies. Watching her struggle to articulate those horrors made Anthony clench his fists under the bench. The judge eventually cut short the cross-examination, saying they wouldn't permit badgering of a traumatized child. Elena was escorted out, leaving the entire courtroom in heavy silence. Anthony spotted a few jury members wiping tears. After weeks of testimony, the jury found Robert and his co-defendants guilty on multiple counts. The sentencing hearing was a subdued affair. Robert was given decades in prison, effectively ensuring he'd never see freedom again. The judge delivered a scathing rebuke, calling the ring's actions monstrous beyond measure. Anthony felt a wave of relief wash over him in that moment. He and Jordan clasped hands outside the courthouse, a silent acknowledgement of the bond formed by their shared ordeal. Media coverage of the sentencing portrayed them as local heroes, although Anthony remained uncomfortable with the label. He had simply refused to look away when he saw a child in distress. But in a world where so many people did just that, look away, maybe it was heroic. The mall underwent sweeping security reforms. More cameras, mandatory training sessions for employees to spot signs of trafficking, an anonymous tip line for suspicious activity. They partnered with local police to create a presence that went beyond the typical rent-a-cops approach. Karen, however, stepped down under the weight of the scandal. Publicly, she expressed regret for not acting sooner. Anthony, while still frustrated with how she'd initially handled it, acknowledged she'd eventually made the right call. He wished her no ill will as she quietly left her position. Elena's parents eventually returned from overseas, shocked and horrified by what had happened. However, due to circumstances Anthony never fully understood, some combination of messy legalities and emotional distance, Elena remained with her foster family. The arrangement was voluntary, as her parents apparently felt it best for her continued therapy and healing in a stable environment. Over the next year, she slowly blossomed. Anthony and Jordan visited occasionally, bringing small gifts or simply offering companionship. Elena began trusting them more, greeting them with shy smiles, her eyes no longer haunted by constant fear. She was still in therapy, wrestling with nightmares, but she had hope. And that was enough for Anthony to feel some measure of peace. Life at the mall found a new normal. Sales promotions returned, crowds bustled. People eventually stopped whispering about the trafficking ring, drawn to the next local scandal or big event. Anthony kept his job for a while, though he often considered applying to the police academy or a child protection agency. He felt drawn to more direct work in preventing crimes like what had befallen Elena. But for the time being, he chose to remain at Greenfields Mall, training new guards, making sure none of them dismissed suspicious situations outright. "Trust your instincts," he told them. "If a kid looks terrified, find out why. Better to overstep once than regret not stepping in." Jordan returned to his routine, raising Lydia, balancing work. But he also grew more involved in local community outreach, sharing the story to educate others about the signs of trafficking. He'd speak at PTA meetings, urging parents and teachers to remain vigilant. If not for his willingness to speak up, Elena might have been lost in the system forever. Elena's final hearing, the one that determined her long-term living arrangements, ended with her foster parents granted permanent guardianship. She seemed content there. Anthony quietly celebrated, knowing that in a sense, a piece of his life would always be connected to hers. One brisk Saturday, he visited her at the foster home, stepping onto the porch with a small bag of art supplies. She opened the door, the stuffed bear he'd once given her still tucked under her arm. "Anthony," she greeted softly, stepping aside so he could enter the cozy living room. He noticed the walls decorated with pictures she'd drawn, flowers, suns, a few shaky figures that looked like people holding hands. It warmed his heart to see her comfortable. He gave her the art supplies, and she beamed. "Thank you," she said. "I like drawing. My therapist says it helps me express things I can't talk about yet." She fiddled with a pencil. "Is that weird?" "Not at all," Anthony assured her. "Whatever helps you feel better. You're safe now." Her gaze dropped to the bear. "Are there more kids like me? Kids who never got found?" Anthony hesitated, feeling a lump in his throat. "There are," he admitted softly. "But I'm working to make sure we find them. And I hope more people do what Jordan and I did. Pay attention, follow their instincts." She nodded, eyes shining with emotion. "You didn't know me," she whispered, "but you still helped." He didn't know how to respond, so he gave her a gentle smile. "That's what people should do," he finally said. She held the bear a little tighter, and for a moment, the living room felt like a sanctuary, separate from all the horrors in the world. Eventually, Anthony said his goodbyes and stepped outside, blinking against the bright afternoon light. His phone buzzed with a message from Jordan, who was simply checking in. Anthony typed back quickly, letting him know Elena was doing well. He paused, Taking a deep breath, reflecting on how drastically his life had changed since that day he first spotted a frightened girl at the mall fountain. A part of him had grown hardened, aware that child trafficking was more prevalent than he'd ever imagined. But another part had softened, buoyed by the knowledge that direct, compassionate action could rip a child out of the jaws of evil. In the months that followed, Anthony found a sense of renewed purpose. The local police, impressed by his role in busting the ring, extended an offer to join their training program. At first, Anthony hesitated, worried that he lacked the experience. But Jordan, along with some of the officers he'd worked with, encouraged him. Eventually, with Elena's subtle, unspoken blessing, he could tell she wanted him to keep protecting other kids. He decided to go for it. He set a date to leave the mall once the new security protocols were fully in place and the new hires were trained. On his last day at Greenfields, a small group of co-workers gathered to wish him well. They gave him a card, scrawled with thanks for making the mall safer. Some of the store managers he'd befriended stopped by to shake his hand, praising his perseverance. Jordan showed up with Lydia, the little girl excitedly presenting Anthony with a homemade good luck card. Anthony's chest tightened with gratitude. After a brief round of hugs and well wishes, he made one final patrol through the corridors, revisiting the site of the fountain where he'd first seen Elena. The water's gentle trickle and coin-littered bottom felt symbolic somehow, countless wishes cast by children who believed in small miracles. He stepped outside, the sun dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and pink. As he walked to his car, his phone pinged with a text from Elena's foster mother, a simple note: "Elena just finished a new drawing. She wants to show you sometime." Anthony smiled, replying that he'd love to see it, that he'd visit as soon as he could. Starting tomorrow, he'd be wearing a different uniform, training to become a police officer with a mission to keep children safe on a broader scale. His heart pounded with a mix of nerves and anticipation. The future was uncertain, but he knew one thing: he would never again ignore a child's cry for help. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.